The MiG-1 is an interesting airplane. Its name sounds like the beginning of a legend, but in reality, it feels more like the opening scene of the Soviet fighter disaster reel. This was the first true fighter from the Mikoyan-designed Euro. It first flew on April 5, 1940, and on paper it didn't look terrible. It was designed as a high-altitude fighter with respectable speed and a service ceiling of around 39,000 feet. But the problems showed up almost immediately. Flight testing revealed a long list of issues, and the aircraft was ordered into production anyway. It wasn't especially friendly to fly. The handling problems weren't fully fixed, and before it could prove itself, it already exposed a classic Soviet weakness. The airplane wasn't finished, but the mission had already arrived. Most MiG-1s were lost in the opening days of Operation Barbarossa. More than anything, it felt like a rough draft that got thrown into combat too early. And the really awkward part is that the MiG-1 wasn't even the end of the story. The Soviets quickly realized this airplane couldn't be saved with a few quick fixes, which is why the MiG-3 showed up right behind it. But changing the number didn't make the real problem disappear. It just came back in a different, and in some ways even more frustrating, form. Because the MiG-3 was not a hopeless airplane. At high altitude, it actually looked pretty good for 1941. At around 23,600 feet, it could hit roughly 398 miles per hour, and its service ceiling was close to 39,000 feet. It was built around the idea of high-altitude interception. The problem was that the Eastern Front had other ideas. Most early air combat happened at low and medium altitude, and down there the MiG-3 lost the very advantages it had been designed around. Its speed edge faded, its maneuverability became less impressive, and it demanded more from pilots than the Red Air Force could easily provide. By June 1941, more than 1,000 MiG-3s were on strength, but only a fraction of the pilots assigned to them had actually completed conversion training. So the plane was already demanding, and the battlefield was forcing it into exactly the kind of fighting it handled worst. Losses were brutal. More and more surviving MiG-3s were eventually transferred to Soviet air defense units, where they could finally do the sort of interception work they had been designed for in the first place. In other words, the MiG-3 wasn't simply bad. It was an airplane born for the wrong battlefield. And if the MiG-3 was frustrating because its concept wasn't entirely wrong, just badly matched to reality, then the LAG-3 was frustrating in a much more immediate and physical way. Because with the LAG-3, the problem didn't need much explanation. Pilots could feel it as soon as they got in the air. It was heavy. When it entered frontline service in the summer of 1941, it quickly revealed a brutal truth. It wasn't unarmed, and it wasn't fragile. In fact, its wooden construction was tough and not especially prone to catching fire. But once it had to fight Bf-109FS, the things that decide life and death in a dogfight, climb, acceleration, and agility, started working against it. The LAG-3 somehow managed to be wooden and still overweight, while also lacking the power to make up for it. That is pure Soviet fighter black comedy. Eventually, the nicest thing many people could say about the LAG-3 was that it was sturdy. And that says a lot. When the most reassuring thing about a fighter is not that it can win, but that it might not immediately burn when hit, you already know how this story goes. That's why the LAG-3 kept such a bad reputation for so long. Its real tragedy was that even its strengths barely felt like strengths. Up to this point, though, these were still the problems of the piston engine era. Then the war ended, the jet age arrived, and the Soviets quickly discovered that the old problems weren't gone at all. They had simply found new ways to come back. The Yak-15 was the Soviet jet era's most obvious just-get-it-airborne somehow machine. It first flew in 1946, 280 were built, and while it carried the label of a fighter, that's not really what mattered most about it. Underneath, it was basically a Yak-3 piston fighter adapted into a jet. It had a respectable top speed for a stopgap design and a decent ceiling, but a very short range. And it barely left behind any meaningful combat record, because its real job was not to dominate the front line. Its real job was to help pilots trained on piston fighters transition into the jet age. That made it useful, but also awkward. The Yak-15's real problem wasn't that it couldn't fly. It was that the Soviet Union's first step into the jet age wasn't elegant at all. It was improvised, transitional, and a little desperate. The MiG-9 took that same awkwardness and turned it into a systems problem. This was the first true jet MiG. It first flew in 1946, and around 610 were built between 1946 and 1948. On the surface, it looked like the Soviet Union had finally stepped properly into the jet era. But the MiG-9's most infamous flaw was a nasty one. When it fired its guns at altitude, gun gas could be ingested into the engine intakes and cause flameouts. And for a fighter, that is about as bad as it sounds. The worst thing is not weak firepower. The worst thing is pulling the trigger and losing the engine. The Soviets tried several fixes, different gun arrangements, different flow solutions, even that famous butterfly deflector, and none of them truly solved the problem. That's what makes the MiG-9 such a perfect jet age embarrassment. The door had been kicked open, yes. The new era had arrived. But the airplane itself still felt like a construction site. In a strange way, part of the reason the MiG-15 looked so revolutionary later on is because the MiG-9 had done such an excellent job showing how rough the opening chapter really was. From here on, Soviet fighter problems started changing shape. Earlier aircraft mostly suffered from haste and transition. But once the Cold War air defense system took center stage, the problem became something else. The Soviet Union kept building fighters that were increasingly specialized, to the point that outside their intended system, they barely made sense anymore. The Su-9 was one of the clearest early examples of that trend. It first flew in 1956, entered service in 1959, could reach around 1,386 miles per hour, climbed to 65,000 feet, and roughly 1,150 were built. On paper, it looked like the answer to Cold War high-altitude interception. But its role was incredibly narrow. A single-engine, all-weather missile interceptor designed to work inside a tightly controlled air defense network. It carried beam-riding missiles and no gun. That already told you what kind of airplane it was. And when the 1960 U-2 incident happened, the Soviets even sent an unarmed Su-9 to try to intercept the target, with the pilot reportedly given ramming orders if necessary. That detail says everything. The aircraft could go fast, yes. But the moment the system faced a target that didn't fit the plan, the solution became absurdly primitive. The Su-9 wasn't useless. It was just too dependent on the system around it. The Su-11 was supposed to be the fix. It got a longer nose, better radar, more powerful engine, and entered service in 1964. But only 108 were built, which already tells you how this ended. The Su-11 did improve things, but not enough to escape the same core problem. It was still a high-altitude, missile-dependent, ground-controlled interceptor with no gun and a very narrow mission set. So the Su-11 ended up in a strange place historically. It wasn't a complete failure, but it also wasn't the airplane that changed the game. If the Su-9 needed patching, the Su-11 was basically the patched version that still didn't quite make people comfortable. Then came the Su-15, and with it, this whole approach reached its peak. The Su-15 first flew in 1962, entered service in 1965. Around 1,290 were built. It could reach Mach 2.5, and its climb rate was immense. This was a purpose-built high-speed interceptor in the purest sense. And that was both its strength and its weakness. It was extremely good at doing one thing inside the Soviet air defense system: scramble, climb fast, and go after targets under command guidance. But it was not an aircraft built for ambiguity. The 1983 Korean Airlines Flight 007 shootdown made that brutally clear. Inside the system, the Su-15 was a sharp tool. But once the interception picture became politically explosive, legally murky, and operationally confused, the same kind of aircraft turned from a military asset into an international scandal. The Su-15's problem was never that it was slow or weak. Its problem was that it had been built for a world where everything was supposed to be clearer than it ever really was. After that, the Soviets no longer wanted fighters that were merely specialized pieces of a system. They wanted one aircraft to do more: stronger radar, better missiles, better runway flexibility, bigger combat reach, more advanced aerodynamics. And from that point on, Soviet fighter problems started looking less like gaps and more like bills coming due. The early MiG-23 is one of the best examples of that bill arriving all at once. This was the intended successor to the MiG-21. The goals sounded great: variable sweep wings, stronger radar, beyond visual range capability, improved takeoff and landing performance, better low-altitude interception. The United States Air Force's museum description makes it clear it was supposed to be a major leap. The problem was that trying to leap across too many gaps at once meant the frontline units ended up paying the price first. Early MiG-23s really did bring speed and radar ambition, but they also brought complexity, maintenance burden, uneven handling qualities, and maneuverability issues. Then came the 1982 Lebanon War, and Soviet prestige took a hit. Israeli air power, using a much better integrated mix of radar, electronic warfare, command and control, and air combat doctrine, mauled Syrian MiGs in the Bekaa Valley. Publicly cited figures often mention around 85 Syrian MiGs lost for essentially no meaningful exchange rate in return. The MiG-23's problem was never that it looked outdated on paper. The problem was that once you put the early versions into a modern, high-intensity, systems-driven air war, the cost of all that complexity showed up all at once. And on the naval side, the Yak-38 may be the single most obvious embodiment of Soviet compromise in aircraft form. This was the first Soviet fixed-wing carrier jet to actually enter meaningful operational service. It entered service in 1976, retired in 1991, and 231 were built. But its real problem was not top speed. It was the layout. One main engine, plus 2 dedicated lift engines, which meant a huge amount of internal space, fuel, and maintenance effort was spent not on fighting, but on the basic miracle of getting the thing to rise vertically. That was awkward enough on a carrier deck. Then in 1980, several Yak-38s were sent to Afghanistan for the ROM-1 trials, and things looked even worse. High altitude, high temperature, and dust all combined to expose the aircraft's weaknesses at once. For aircraft flew just a dozen trial sorties, and at times the practical payload was barely more than 2 small bombs. You don't really need a lecture in aerodynamics to understand what that means. The moment the Yak-38 was forced to prove itself in harsh real conditions, its built-in compromises stepped forward all at once. That's why it kept becoming the butt of jokes later. The Yak-38 really did carry the full cost of the VTOL concept on its back. After the Yak-38 had been mocked into the ground, the Soviets did try to recover. The Yak-141 was the closest they came. Only 4 prototypes were built. It first flew in 1987, began carrier trials in 1991, and during testing it set 12 world records. Which means that by this point, Soviet VTOL carrier aviation was no longer just an awkward emergency solution. It was beginning to resemble a real next-generation naval fighter. And that is exactly what makes its fate so painful. In September 1991, the Yak-141 completed its first carrier landing. After a handful of shipboard flights, one hard landing in October ruptured a fuel tank and caused a fire. The pilot ejected. Soon after that, the Soviet Union itself was collapsing, the money was disappearing, and the program was frozen. The Yak-141 is memorable not because it was obviously terrible. It's memorable because it had almost reached the future, and then the future got pulled away first. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the embarrassment of the carrier fighter line did not disappear. It simply landed on the Su-33 instead. Taken by itself, the Su-33 isn't a bad-looking aircraft at all. It came from the Su-27 family. The first production example flew in 1990, and it officially entered service as the Su-33 in 1998. Large airframe, lots of fuel, multiple hardpoints. It looked like exactly the kind of heavyweight naval fighter that ought to project power at sea. But once it actually entered service, it was trapped inside a much smaller reality. A single carrier, limited deployments, tight operating conditions, and chronic support issues. During Russia's 2016 deployment off Syria, the Russians said their carrier-based Su-33s and MiG-29KS flew more than 400 sorties and struck about 1,300 targets. But in that same deployment, a Su-33 was lost returning to the carrier when an arresting wire failed. And that is what makes the Su-33 so frustrating. The airplane itself is not the embarrassing part. The environment around it is. Every time it tries to prove itself, reality drags the surrounding ecosystem's flaws into view with it. Up to this point, Most of the aircraft on this list at least made it into service before their flaws became obvious. In the Russian era, things sometimes got even more painful. Some aircraft never even made it that far. Their failure happened at the project level. The MiG 1.42 and 1.44 is one of the clearest examples of a fighter losing to history before it could really enter it. This was meant to be one of Russia's answers to the fifth-generation fighter challenge. Super maneuverability, super cruise ambitions, advanced avionics, some stealth shaping. The goals were serious. But the timeline says everything. What was supposed to be a frontline future fighter project ended up first flying only on February 29, 2000, about 9 years late. It flew only a handful of times before the program was effectively killed, eventually giving way to the more practical and more affordable P-8FA path. The MiG 1.44's problem was not that it became the worst flying fighter of its age. Its problem was that it was supposed to prove Russia could still compete for the future, and it never really got the chance to say that out loud before the future moved on. The Su-47, meanwhile, was Russia's most glamorous public display of technological idealism. Forward-swept wings, canards, black paint, a shape that looked like it had arrived from a different timeline. When it appeared, it felt like Russia was saying, "We don't just want to catch up, we want to try something different." But the Su-47 was always a technology demonstrator. Only one was built. Forward-swept wings do offer real advantages, especially in high angle of attack controllability and low-speed handling. But they also bring brutal structural problems, especially torsional stress and aeroelastic instability. So the ending was almost inevitable. The Su-47's beauty was real, and so was the fact that it could not become a practical, mass-produced frontline fighter. In the end, it served more as a pathfinder for technologies that would influence later aircraft like the Su-35 and Su-57 than as a combat aircraft in its own right. That's exactly why it deserves to be mocked a little. It looked so much like the future that it ended up feeling more like a performance than a program. And finally, there is the MiG-35, probably the best example of a modern Russian fighter whose embarrassment comes not from the brochure, but from what happened after the brochure. Because on paper, the MiG-35 is not ridiculous at all. According to UAC, it first flew in 2016, has a top speed around 2,100 kilometers per hour, a service ceiling of 16,000 meters, a climb rate of 240 meters per second, 6,500 kilograms of payload, radar claimed to detect targets at around 160 kilometers and track 30 while engaging 6, and engines with a 4,000-hour service life. Put that on a spec sheet by itself, and nobody would immediately call it one of Russia's most embarrassing fighters. But that's exactly why its real problem becomes more obvious. If the paper stats look this modern, then why has the aircraft struggled so hard to establish itself as a real mainstream platform? The first contract signed in 2018 covered only 6 aircraft. The first 2 deliveries followed in 2019. And after that, much of the public discussion kept circling back to the same questions. Why is the order so small? Why is export traction so weak? And who actually needs this aircraft badly enough to buy it in serious numbers? So the MiG-35's problem isn't that it can't fly. It's that its credibility never really took off. The Soviets and Russians had plenty of disasters. America had more than a few of its own. And some of those failures were even more ridiculous than the Soviet ones. Click the video and watch America's history of fighter flops.